Hey, greetings, friends, and welcome to Lecture 2 of Week 7. In the last lecture, we talked about the importance of culture, but also we talked about the ways in which toxic, competing, or contradictory cultures can sabotage the vision and the mission of an organization or a church. And I want to spend some time just right here on the front end of this lecture as we set up the movement into how do we begin to architect a culture. I want to look at and think about some of the various ways in which culture in our churches is often misaligned. And I think this adds some flesh to the bones that we're talking about when we talk about what toxic, competing, and contradictory culture can look like within life at church. Perhaps there is a sense that you want to be an empowering leader. You want to give people permission to excel, to grow, to put into place their gifts. You want to be an empowerer and a coach for people. But perhaps you've inherited a culture where for decades, the assumption is that all decisions eventually have to arrive on the desk of the single sole leader of the organization, which is you. So no matter how much you want to give away, everything seems to come back to you. And we have to understand that that is a part of the culture, the inherited culture of the organization that continues to misalign the aspirations of being an empowering organization with the actuality of being an organization that is restricted by this sort of bottleneck that is often the result of people's placement of all the authority into one person. Or say, for instance, there's a desire to reach a broken and lost community. So say, and this is where I think oftentimes the church culture is significantly misaligned with the context of a community. Say the goal is to reach that community, and yet the value system of that culture, and it may not even be fully expressed. It may just linger in the way people refer to the church or talk about the church. It's family, it's safe. What they mean is that they have built a sort of bubble around their church family, and there's an expectation that when they come, things will be well ordered and they'll be safe, and they'll be able to trust the people that they're turning their kids over, and by reaching that broken, hurt community, even though there's an intention and a desire to want to do that, there's no capacity to be able to act upon that, because to reach them would threaten this unconfessed residual value that lingers and lays in the culture of the organization. Maybe there's a longing to reach people for Christ. I've never met a church that says we don't care about evangelism. I meet churches all the time that say we care about evangelism, but the implicit cultural assumption is just not that much. And what I mean by that is we want to reach people for Jesus, but we don't want that to mean that we grow as a church because we like everybody that we know. We know everybody here at this church, and to grow too big might cause disruption, may cause struggles. We might not be able to get together in the same way that we used to. And so there's this competing claim, or this competing desire to want to see people come to Jesus, but also want to preserve the size and the integrity of the community of people that we have already. Or maybe it's establishing a compassionate presence in a community. There's a desire to engage the really hurt and broken folks that are a part of it. And yet, embedded in the culture are these toxic assumptions, maybe about why those people are in that place in the first place. Maybe there's toxic assumptions that they've probably done something to deserve it, or it's their fault that they're in that predicament, or if they just pull up their bootstraps. So compassion sounds good from a Jesus-esque sort of way, and yet I do think there's oftentimes these competing claims that make the manifestation of compassion nearly impossible within the context of many of our congregations. Or maybe there's an assumption that we want our church to have a compassionate presence in the community as long as it's out there and away from where we gather so that we remain safe. Maybe there's a desire to see newcomers become a part of the church, and that the value system is that we just operate with the assumption everybody knows how to get around and do what they need to do at our church, and everybody knows everyone anyways, and it's really hard to ever feel like a new person is a part of the congregation. So in what ways does our values and our culture need to change and to become more embracing of those newcomers. Or maybe the assumption is, Pastor, we want you to lead us, and yet, as a part of this culture, because of the high turnover that pastors have had in that congregation, so maybe over 2 to 3 years they're replacing pastors, we want a pastor to lead us, and yet every time the pastor tries to make a decision, all eyes shift to that person who's been a member of the board for 10, 15, 20 years. And it's not because maybe necessarily 10, 15, 20 years ago that person sought to be that voice. It's just that they have been seen as the stable one in the midst of all of those pastors who have come and go, and perhaps without even realizing, as a part of the embedded culture, that person has taken that responsibility on their shoulders, embodied and embedded that in their lives, and what it has caused is they've actually become something that they would have never intended to be, which is someone who's in control of the decision making of the church. Those are just some of the ways that I think churches can often misalign their culture with the actual desires that they have to fulfill a vision or a mission or a change or reaching people for Jesus. And I think we have to be aware of those things. So my question is for you, as you begin to work through your own journey in this, is where do you see the misalignments in the culture of your organization, in the culture of your church? And we'll talk a little bit more about architecting culture in the next lecture.